Well, there's been a small breakthrough in my life the last couple days that I am really grateful for and wanted to talk about and share. And so this video is a little bit about how I have processed the last 15 months of early retirement and how that's gone, how it hasn't gone how I thought it would, and kind of the place I'm at now. And yeah, so I'll give a quick summary and then try and get right into it so it's not this 35-minute deal. So, first thing you have to know if you're watching this is that I'm a Christian. I read the Bible. I try and live out what the Bible calls a Christian to live out. And and so one of those concepts is, to pick up your cross and follow Christ and to go and make disciples of all nations and to be evangelistic and to offer the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ to as many people as possible. And some people go, some people stay, some people fund, some people pass out tracts. There's lots of different members of the body of Christ. But as someone who realized early on that we in the United States are extremely rich, and the Bible has a lot of tough things to say against the rich man. Um, One of the things that my wife and I tried to do right away is to live on a budget, to live a frugal, simple life, to pay off our house, to get out of debt. And once we had gotten out of debt, we kind of ran into a bit of a paralysis of not knowing what to do with all this extra money that we had every month, trying to give some of it away, but that just didn't feel like the right choice. And a friend of mine turned me on to a concept called FIRE, Financially Independent Retire Early. I'll let you Google that or watch some of my other videos. And we began saving lots of money with the purpose of retiring. Retirement in that case meaning no longer dependent on income in order to be able to live. And the idea behind that came from an old friend of mine named Matt Cardell, who used to volunteer at the youth group at my church back then, Trinity Presbyterian in Plymouth, Michigan. And he said something along the lines of, if your desire is to say yes to God when he calls you to do something, then in preparation for that call from him, you should put yourself in a position where you can easily say yes. So, in other words, it's kind of like hoping, your girlfriend will call and ask you to do something this weekend, and then sort of saying no to a bunch of friends who are inviting you out this weekend with the hopes that she'll call and you'll be able to say yes without having to cancel and rearrange your plans. Anyway, stupid analogy. So my wife and I started saving a lot of money, and in February of last year, 2023, God just laid it on my heart finally to take that step and to leave Volkswagen. I walked away from a $115,000 a year job and the safety and security that comes with that, and we started to live off of our savings, which is around $420,000. Okay, so what I really heard the Lord say is, it's time to leave VW. And I automatically inserted a bunch of assumptions. There was this ministry that I was working with a little bit and thought like, okay, great, I'll leave Volkswagen and I'll go to this ministry. And then our church started doing a bunch of mission trips. And I thought, okay, great, I'll go on all these mission trips because I think the Lord's preparing us for missions. And I just kind of started inserting, I think, my own assumptions. And they weren't bad assumptions. I mean, helping, women who are in a pregnancy crisis is a good and noble thing. Going on the mission trips that I've gone to are as good and noble thing. But I think it really wasn't what the Lord had for me. I was just kind of assuming those things and taking charge. And so those things weren't bad things to do, and they didn't really go bad, but they just kind of didn't pan out the way that we thought they would pan out. Anyway, in the meantime, I have had hanging over my fireplace for 5 years a quote that made my wife tear up when she first saw it, and it's by C.S. Lewis. It says, "Children are not distractions from more. Children are not distractions from more important work. They are the most important work." And that was something that my wife and I believed, and we sort of knew objectively and had experienced to some extent subjectively and experientially. Um, and so as I've been off of work and as I've been in my children's life much more, it's been wonderful and I've loved it. And yet there's this part of me that has felt kind of guilty that I had all of this time, basically all day, every day to be a Christian and to be a father and to be a husband and things like this, while so many other men are doing lots of other things plus that. And I'd use the analogy once or twice about how, if somebody practices piano 10 hours a day and another person practices piano, 1 hour a week, they're both pianists, but they're going to end up being very different piano players at the end of their life. And so there are people who father, and they father, mornings and evenings and weekends. And that's how I fathered for a long time. And now I'm fathering all the time. And what I'm not trying to say that I'm the only one who's fathering correctly. Not at all. I'm just trying to say that now I'm fathering a lot more than I used to. And that kind of brings up this obvious comparison to mothering. Of course, there are working moms and there are stay at home moms. And I was raised by a stay at home mom. Um, and my wife was not. And that difference between us has led to a lot of discussions over the years, as you can imagine. Um, and pretty early on in our engagement, my wife said and knew that she wanted to be a stay-at-home mom, and that's what I wanted for her as well. And so it worked out great. Well, as time went on and we began to develop friendships with people whose wives worked, and then children came into the mix. And so you had, two people working 40 some hours a week, and the kids would be in daycare or with grandma or something like that. Um, we began to ask questions of ourselves, of others, and it's kind of a challenging topic because there's not necessarily, there's not an 11th commandment that says thou shall be a stay-at-home mom or thou shall be a stay-at-home dad. And there are commandments on raising your children and raising them in the Lord. But there's also just kind of this practical approach that you can take on the thing. It's like if you buy a really fast sports car and then you leave it in your garage all the time and you barely drive it, well, that doesn't make much sense. And if you choose to have children and then you kind of put them in daycare as soon as you can and put them in school as soon as you can, to some extent that doesn't make a lot of sense. What's the purpose of children? Um, and so there's like this analogy, but then there's also the question of like, well, how many hours a week or a day should a parent spend with their children before it's considered like enough? And you kind of, what's the minimum, what's the maximum? And that's an interesting question. And one of the things about 6 years ago, my wife and I kind of did the math on is I basically figured out that since the kids weren't yet in school, but we were planning on homeschooling, I kind of realized like, okay, every week my wife spends 50 hours with the children that I don't because I'm working at Volkswagen. And then you multiply 50 times 52 weeks, and you multiply 52 weeks by 18 years, and the amount of time that my wife was going to spend with my children compared to me was astronomical. I mean, it's just insane. I think I did the calculation, and it was the equivalent of going from kindergarten all the way up to the PhD level 3 times. And so there was just this disparity between my wife and I as to how much we will be raising our own children between the two of us, and just how much time we'd be spending with them. And one of the things that I at that time realized was how I had to face the same question that I was wanting other married couples with children to face. And so the scenario goes something like this. Well, okay, so let's say you have a husband and a wife who each make $50,000, and they take out they're married, they take out a mortgage, they have cars, maybe they have a little boat or timeshare or something, I don't know, and then they start having children. Well, it's unlikely that they'll be able to maintain that lifestyle that they have created for themselves on a single income. And so it makes the couple feel like the woman has to work. In fact, I had a friend say, my wife has to work or we can't survive, even though he was making like $105,000 a year plus bonus, which is just a ridiculous statement. And yet, people really do feel that way because they've gotten themselves into a particular lifestyle that requires a certain amount of income. Anyway, so and so my wife and I over the years had said things like, well, what people are really doing when both the husband and the wife work is they're unwilling to give up some of life's luxuries for the sake of raising their children, whether that's vacation or a big house or lease cars or fancy clothing or, there's a long list of things. And my wife and I looked at that quite critically because we love our children, we enjoy them, and so the moms and the dads who weren't seeing their children that much, it seemed like a tragedy to us. That was kind of one argument. Then there was the practical argument of, why have kids if you're not going to raise them yourself and be with them yourself? Then there was the spiritual argument about, children have been assigned to parents for rearing and raising, not to, not to daycare, not to school. And if you look at history, whether you look at 2,000 years of history or 5,000 years of history or 10,000, whatever it is, things like daycare and even the school system where you send your kid off to school, these are relatively novel ideas, hundreds of years old, not 10,000s of years old. And so in the past, kind of the working mom, kid in daycare, kid in school, kid in latchkey after school, like that opportunity didn't even really exist. And so we're kind of in this new age where one can have a child and then basically pay someone else to raise it, more or less, depending on what you consider to be like the minimum amount of time spent with children before, you're really not the ones raising them anymore. And you hear, my wife used to work at a daycare, and there were examples where, children were closer with a caregiver at the daycare than their own mother. And in my view, that's just tragic. Anyway, back to me, not trying to make it about other couples or other mothers. So one of the things that I realized is that my wife and I could give up some of our luxurious lifestyle choices if I wanted to be around the kids more. So I realized, well, I could sell my house. Um, we could move into a trailer in a trailer park, and we could have one car or maybe even no car. And we could just skip the cell phone and have a landline, and we could go to the library to get internet, and we could just live this super poor lifestyle where we didn't have much money for much, but I worked, maybe, let's say I would work at, I don't know, Ace Hardware as a part-time guy, or maybe as a mechanic part-time, and only bring in $20,000 a year. But us five would be together as a family. And and so I realized that the, let's say, accusation I had against working mothers and dual working couples with kids, to some extent that accusation came back at me. Now, um, it's pretty uncommon for two parents to raise their own family, where you know the neither person is working full time. But it's not impossible. And if one was willing to give up some of life's luxuries and live in a trailer park or something, or even I don't know, move in with a parent, then it was possible. And yeah, so we gave that a lot of thought. That was like 6 or 7 years ago. And so here I am, fast forward, and I've walked away from my job, my career, all of those things. And I thought I was going to be leaving Volkswagen and immediately going to something else, missionary work or pastoral work. And now it's been, 14 months, and I haven't been. And you could look at that and just say, you shouldn't love Volkswagen, or you suck, and you're not good for anything else. Or, I mean, there's a bunch of ways to look at it, many of which I would see the logic in. And something I really can't communicate to others is just the peace that I have had. Um, of this phase of life. I have never questioned what I heard from God on that airplane, that it was time to leave VW. I have not once wished to go back. I have not really once regretted leaving. And I've not been lazy either. Like, I don't enjoy, those who know me, like, I don't enjoy laying around and watching television and doing nothing. Like, I am a producer. I like to be challenged. I like to achieve. And so in many ways, this new lifestyle, which contains quite a bit less of those things, has been a real challenge for me to accept. Anyhow, um, so I've kind of thought the Lord was leading in a couple of areas: pastoral, teaching, evangelistic, missionary, and other things. And they've kind of all just been dead ends, but not dead ends that have left me feeling devastated. Um, just kind of like, oh, well, I guess that's not the right way. And anyway, so this morning I was in church. Our pastor was preaching out of John 11, the story of Lazarus and Mary and Martha, a passage that's very familiar to me and very special to my wife for some other reasons, about how Christ stayed even though he loved Mary and Martha. And sometimes he distances himself from people for their good. and that relates to some other stuff going on in my wife's life. But anyway, the point is that he showed in these passages about how Christ waited and sort of didn't give Mary and Martha what they wanted, which was Lazarus's healing. Um, and he, by sort of distancing himself and forcing them to wait, he forced them to set aside their second priority desires in order to reveal their first priority desires, which ultimately was him. And anyway, just really, really touched my heart, really spoke to me, including in some ways that I can't really quite explain. I had trouble even explaining them to my wife today. But I just really have this peace about being a father, being a full-time father with a full-time wife, who's a full-time mother. And and as I was praying today at church, I just thought of this quote above my fireplace, um, and realized that, like 5, 6 years ago, like I put that up there, and I put it up there as an encouragement to my wife, because I wanted her to know how much I stood behind her and beside her as she chose to do something kind of countercultural, not super countercultural, but to be a stay-at-home mom, and then to become a homeschooling mom, which wasn't always part of the plan. And I realized, I kind of just thought about that quote, and I just thought, like, geez, James, like, do you believe that? Because your thoughts and your feelings on this are all about basically that, yeah, I'm going to raise my family, but like, God, I need a task. Like, I need another task. And it's like not enough to just raise a family. And I feel like, in the same way that for a long time we had been planning to leave VW and step out in faith, and the Lord just kind of said, like, today's the day. Um, I feel like that also happened today. And just yesterday, my wife and I were driving down from Michigan. We'd been up there for a couple weeks to help my sister move into her new house and stuff. Anyway, and we were talking about that like we keep thinking that the Lord has called us from one place, VW, and is sending us to the next one, and we're just in transition. But like, there's no guarantee of that. This might be where we're going to be for a long time. And just to stop making assumptions and inserting new ideas that we think the Lord has for us, which He may or may not. Um, yeah, and so I suppose what I want to say, um, in summary, is that children are worth raising. That's the first thing. Um, they're one of the things that I think is so funny is when you hear someone say, "I'm proud of you" to a child on their birthday. And it's like, "Oh, you're 10 years old. I'm so proud of you." And I thought, for years ago, I thought that was kind of a funny thing to say, because all you have to do is not die in order to make it to 10 years old. So like, if you think of parenting as like keeping a child alive, then it's a pretty easy task. But there's so much more that you can do with parenting that is a joy and a delight and good for the child and good for the parent and good for the community, good for society. And so I think Steve Jobs once said about software programmers that, the gap between the best taxi driver and the worst taxi driver, it's a small gap. It's not a big gap, but the gap between the best software developers and the worst, it's a huge gap. And I think the same really is true with parenting, where there's lots of people who have had sex and gotten pregnant and inherit the word mom and dad, and then they barely do anything more than keep the child from dying. And then there are people who, just like the person who practices piano 10 hours a day, they practice and they go all in with their children every single day for 18, 20 years, whatever it is. And that's the kind of parent that I'm striving to be. And in the same way that 35 years ago, my mom being a stay-at-home mom, basically no one was doing it. It was illegal in Michigan. Homeschooling, sorry, stay-at-home mom and then homeschooling. It was totally countercultural. It was illegal. It was weird. Nobody understood her. People mocked her. And that's been happening with me. People just, they kind of have been scrutinizing what I've done. They've not understood it. They've been super clumsy with comments about, like, oh yeah, well, you don't have a job. And it's one of these things that I think society maybe doesn't yet know how to cheer for, which I understand. And then I'll just leave you with this one last thought. So I was explaining to someone recently what's been going on in my life and how I'm retired and all of this. And he was really scrutinizing me. Like, you could tell he didn't approve. And that's okay. I've had that before. And then sort of mid conversation, he realized, he's like, like, if you were 65, I would have no problem with what you've done. And then he's like, but that's actually like a problem. Like, basically, he was kind of accusing me of like being 35, retired, and like putting my feet up and just watching Netflix. And he disapproved of that. The irony is that's not even what I do. But then he realized, if I was 65 and retired and putting my feet up and just watching Netflix, he'd be fine with that, which is terrible that he would think that as a Christian man. And, I don't think that the 65 and retire and play golf and hang out on the beach is anywhere found in scriptures. And, and so what's really funny about our society is our society thinks that it's respectable and appropriate to work 40 hours a week. People who do more than that, we tend to call workaholics. People who do less than that, we tend to call lazy or unambitious. Our society thinks it's appropriate to work from age 22 to age 65 and then do whatever the heck you want for the rest of your life. And like, these norms, these standards, like, they're worth challenging. There was a time when people used to also work on Saturday, and they worked more than 40 hours a week, and they worked basically until they died. In many parts of the world, people still work basically until they die. And so we have these norms and these acceptable positions in the world that we think are totally acceptable, and I think those are worth challenging. And so that's what FIRE is kind of all about. That's what this early retirement thing is all about. And in many ways, I think that's what it means to be a countercultural Christian, where you don't just do something different in society to do something different, but you really try and ask the most basic question possible, of, like, how did we get to working 40 hours a week? How did we get to working till 65 years and not 75 or 85 or 55? Why is 65 appropriate? 55 is too early, 75 is too late. And really, just as a philosopher, sort of asking the most basic question feasible, and then not really moving on into those simpler questions until you've answered those more fundamental questions. And I think if you do that, you will end up living a countercultural life, that will get more raised eyebrows. But I think that you won't end up being like a non-player character, if you know that meme, and you'll think for yourself, and you will live a more satisfying life for yourself and the others around you, and a more meaningful life, and ultimately the type of life that society wants and needs you to live. So anyway, bit of a ramble. I hope that that was helpful for someone. If you're still here, I guess it was, because you stayed till the end. And yeah, hopefully it was an encouragement. If not, give this thing a thumbs down so I know not to do long, boring monologues. And thanks for watching. Bye.